The wind carried the crisp scent of roasted chestnuts that night, mingling with the quiet hum of the city. Autumn had wrapped Central Park in a thin blanket of gold, the leaves whispering across the wet pavement as a sleek black car slowed to a stop by the curb. Inside, 6-year-old Lily pressed her tiny hands against the window, eyes wide with innocent curiosity. "Daddy," she said softly. Why is she sleeping on the bench? David Walker followed her gaze. Under the dim halo of a flickering street lamp, a young woman lay curled on one side of a worn wooden bench, her arms wrapped protectively around a baby, no older than a few months. The child's blanket was thin, barely shielding him from the night's chill. The woman's coat, if it could be called that, was little more than a faded cardigan. David exhaled quietly. He had seen poverty before countless times, from the tinted windows of cars like this one. He told himself the same lie he always did. Someone else would help. Someone else always did. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, gently squeezing Lily's hand. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the woman. "She has a baby," Lily whispered. "He's so little. Daddy, won't he be cold?" The question pierced through him. There was no judgment in her voice, only compassion, a sound that echoed the warmth of her late mother. He turned again toward the woman, intending only a glance. But something caught his eye. Around the woman's neck hung a small silver locket, glinting faintly under the streetlight. A simple heart-shaped pendant, engraved in delicate script. "To Naomi, love Aunt Claire." David froze. His pulse stumbled. That name, that engraving. Claire, his late wife's younger sister. The woman whose laughter once filled his home before grief scattered their family to silence. He stepped closer, disbelief tightening his chest. The woman on the bench stirred slightly, her hair falling away from her face. For a split second, the light touched her features, soft, young, and achingly familiar. The same shape of the eyes, the same curve of the mouth. She looked like Claire, no like his wife. The air thickened, the sound of distant traffic faded, until there was only the quiet rhythm of the baby's breathing and the rustle of dry leaves around them. David's heart clenched in confusion. "Who are you?" he wanted to ask, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent years building walls of order and distance after losing his wife. But tonight, those walls began to tremble at the sight of a girl who shouldn't exist in his world, yet somehow carried the ghost of his past within her. He turned to Lily. "Stay here, sweetheart." Crossing the street, his shoes splashed against shallow puddles. As he neared, the woman's eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were startling dark, deep, full of quiet defiance, even in exhaustion. "I'll be fine," she whispered before he could speak, her voice rough but steady. "Please, don't call anyone." David hesitated, the words he meant to say, replaced by something heavier. "Where did you get that locket?" Naomi blinked, confused, her hand instinctively rising to touch it. "It was my aunt's. She gave it to me before she died." Her aunt. Claire. In that instant, everything shifted. The night, the city, the years he had spent alone, all seemed to fold into this single impossible moment. He looked at her again, really looked, and saw not a stranger, but the fragile thread that tied his present grief to a forgotten branch of love. Naomi didn't know who he was. David didn't know what fate had just placed in front of him. But the world suddenly felt smaller, and the distance between two broken souls had just narrowed to a breath. He extended his coat toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come with me, just for tonight." Naomi hesitated. Then slowly she nodded, cradling her child, as if she too could sense that destiny had shifted its gaze upon her. As the car door closed behind them, the city lights shimmered through the window like a quiet promise. Neither of them knew it yet, but love, unexpected, impossible, and healing, had just found its way back into the world. If this story touched something in your heart, let it remind you. Sometimes love doesn't arrive to stay, it arrives to awaken. And when it does, even the coldest night can become the beginning of a home. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a home so quiet it seemed to breathe on its own. The penthouse glowed in muted amber light framed by walls of glass that overlooked the sleeping city. Beyond them, New York shimmered like a restless sea of stars. Naomi hesitated at the threshold, clutching her baby close. Her clothes were still damp from the night rain, her hair clinging in soft curls against her neck. She had never stood inside a space like this, so still, so perfectly arranged, that even the air seemed to belong to someone else. David stepped aside, gesturing gently. "It's just for tonight," he said. His tone was even polite, almost businesslike, but beneath it was something quieter, an ache that neither of them knew how to name. Naomi nodded once and stepped in. Every sound she made felt too loud. The creak of her shoes, the faint rustle of Eli's blanket, the tiny sigh he gave as she held him closer. She looked around. The marble floors reflected the soft glow of recessed lights. The scent of cedar and coffee lingered in the air. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a single framed photograph, David, with a woman and a little girl, taken long before grief had carved shadows into his face. Naomi turned away quickly. She did not need to ask who the woman was. Lily broke the silence first, her small feet padding across the rug. "Can the baby sleep in my room?" she asked, looking up at her father. David smiled faintly. "Just for tonight, sweetheart. Let's give them the guest room." Naomi's lips parted, a quiet protest rising, but she stopped herself. Pride pressed hard against gratitude. "The couch will do fine," she murmured. But David shook his head. "You and the baby need warmth. That's not negotiable." The word negotiable, so out of place in this moment, made her almost smile. Almost. Later, when Lily had gone to bed, Naomi busied herself in the kitchen washing the cups David had used for tea. She didn't ask permission. It felt wrong to do nothing. Her hands moved with purpose, washing, drying, placing each piece back where it belonged, as if by doing so, she could justify the roof over her head. David watched from the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. Naomi didn't turn. "I work for what I use," she replied. Her voice was soft, but firm. He wanted to say something. Something about how help didn't always come with a debt, but he stopped. The set of her shoulders told him she'd had enough of pity in her life. The baby stirred, whimpering. Naomi dried her hands and hurried to lift him. Her touch was gentle but sure, the practiced movement of a mother who'd learned strength the hard way. She whispered something to him, words David couldn't make out, but the tenderness in her tone filled the silence that hung between them. She looked up then, catching him watching. For a heartbeat, their eyes met his, steady and searching, hers cautious, unwilling to be read. The air felt fragile, like the moment before a snowflake melts in your hand. David cleared his throat and turned away. "There are clean towels in the guest bathroom," he said. "If you need anything, just knock." When he was gone, Naomi exhaled slowly, her arms tightening around Eli. The baby's breathing evened warm and steady against her skin. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pale curtains swaying with the faint hum of the heater. For years, she had lived in borrowed spaces, shelters, couches, corners, that didn't belong to her. But this felt different. Not because of the luxury, but because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't invisible. Hours later, while the city whispered outside, Naomi wandered quietly into the living room. The moonlight spilled across the floor soft as milk. On a side table lay a box of colored pencils, lilies. She picked one up, then another, until her hands found a pencil and a piece of sketch paper tucked beneath. Without thinking, she began to draw. Lines appeared hesitant at first, then sure, alive. When she lifted her hand, the image on the page was that of a little girl, sitting by a window streaked with rain, her chin resting on her knees, eyes gazing out as if waiting for someone who never came. The girl was Lily, but the eyes. Those eyes were Naomi's own, reflected from a memory of another rainy night long ago. The soft sound of footsteps made her glance up. David stood behind her barefoot, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows. "She looks sad," he said quietly, studying the sketch. Naomi's lips curved faintly. "She's waiting for the rain to stop." He nodded, understanding more than the words revealed. Neither spoke again. They stood in the half-light, two strangers sharing the same silence, the kind that doesn't demand comfort, but offers it anyway. Outside, the city exhaled, and the rain began again, gentle and steady against the glass. Inside, Naomi placed the drawing on the table beside Lily's pencils, as if leaving behind a small piece of herself in return for the kindness she couldn't yet name. That night, behind strange walls, neither of them slept easily, but for the first time in years, both felt a little less alone. The next morning arrived quietly, with the soft hum of the city breaking through the glass walls of the penthouse. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sound of Lily's laughter somewhere down the hall. Naomi stood by the sink, rinsing breakfast plates, her hands steady, though her thoughts were far away. Each sound in the apartment felt borrowed, the clink of porcelain, the shuffle of slippers against marble floors, even the low rhythm of David's voice on a distant business call. It was all too gentle, too fragile, and she knew better than to trust anything that felt that safe. When Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, entered the kitchen, Naomi greeted her politely, offering a small smile. But the older woman's expression remained cautious, the kind of look built from years of loyalty to her employer. "You don't need to clean." "Dear Mrs. Hill," said her tone, mild but edged. "We have people for that." Naomi nodded. "I know. I just like to keep my hands busy." Mrs. Hill paused, wiping her palms on a dish towel, before speaking again, lower this time. "Mr. Walker has a kind heart. Sometimes too kind. You'd be wise not to mistake it for something else." The words hung in the air like smoke. Naomi froze the plate still in her hand. "I'm not mistaking anything," she said quietly. But Mrs. Hill continued, her voice tightening. "You seem decent. But I've seen people take advantage of him before. He doesn't deserve that again." Naomi's throat tightened. She didn't reply. When Mrs. Hill left, the silence that followed was sharp and heavy. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep and the city lights flickered across the skyline, Naomi stood in the guest room staring at the open suitcase on the bed. Her few belongings, a folded dress, Eli's small blanket, a sketchbook, looked even smaller under the soft lamplight. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being looked at as someone who wanted something she hadn't earned. Tired of living in borrowed warmth. Eli stirred in his crib and she brushed his cheek gently with her fingers. "We'll be okay," she whispered. "We always are." Down the hall, David was in his study, the faint glow from the desk lamp outlining his face as he read through papers he wasn't really seeing. He'd been thinking of Naomi more than he wanted to admit, the quiet grace with which she moved, the way she laughed with Lily, how her eyes softened when she drew. He was still there, lost in thought, when the sound of the front door latch clicked. Naomi, her coat draped over one arm, had slipped quietly into the hallway. Her steps were soft, measured. But before she could reach the elevator, a small voice called out from behind her. Naomi turned, startled. Lily stood barefoot in her pajamas, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her curls were mussed from sleep, her eyes wide and confused. "Where are you going?" Naomi hesitated. "It's late, sweetheart. Go back to bed." Lily shook her head, tears already gathering. "Please don't go." She took a small, trembling step forward. "Mommy used to say, kindness is never wasted." Naomi's heart broke a little at the sound of those words. She knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Your mommy was a very wise woman. She said that's why Daddy helps people," Lily whispered, "because she wanted him to keep doing it." Naomi's breath caught. The child's voice trembled, innocent, yet filled with something older, faith maybe, or memory. And in that instant, Naomi saw not a wealthy man or a grand apartment, but a little girl, still holding on to her mother, through echoes. Behind them, footsteps approached. David appeared in the hallway, his tie loosened, the faint weariness of work still clinging to him. His eyes took in the scene, the open door, the packed bag, Lily's small hand gripping Naomi's. "You heard her?" Naomi said softly without turning. "Your housekeeper was right. I shouldn't be here." David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Mrs. Hill means well. She worries too much." "She's not wrong," Naomi replied. "I'm a stranger with nothing but a child and a story. That doesn't look good from the outside." David stepped closer, his voice lower now. "If you were here to take advantage of me, you wouldn't be leaving." Naomi looked up at him then. The truth in his tone caught her off guard. For a moment, all she could do was stand there, feeling the pull between leaving and staying. Lily reached out again, her small fingers curling around Naomi's hand. "Please," she whispered. Something inside Naomi gave way. Her shoulders dropped, and the tension in her face softened. David moved closer still, lowering his voice to something almost tender. "You don't have to prove that you deserve help," he said. "Sometimes it's enough just to accept it." Their eyes met. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, layered with grief, guilt, and something that felt dangerously like hope. David saw it then, the flicker in Naomi's eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of needing someone again. It was the same look that had haunted him for years after his wife's death. The fear of loving and losing. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Stay," he said simply. Naomi didn't answer, but she set her bag down. When David turned off the hallway light, the apartment fell into a warm, half-darkness. In the quiet, the faint rhythm of Eli's breathing drifted through the room, blending with Lily's soft sniffles. For the first time since grief had entered his life, David felt the walls around his heart shift. And in that fragile stillness, he knew he wasn't the only one learning how to let someone back in. The following weeks unfolded like the slow bloom of spring after a long, relentless winter. The house that once echoed with silence began to fill with small sounds again. The hum of lullabies, the clatter of pencils on the living room table, the soft laughter of a little girl and a woman who hadn't smiled in far too long. Naomi spent her mornings caring for Eli and helping Lily with her school projects. But when the apartment grew still in the afternoons, she found herself drawn toward the large window overlooking Central Park. There, with the city sprawled beneath her and light spilling like honey across the floor, she began to draw again. At first, it was tentative, simple sketches of trees, of faces she half remembered from dreams. Her hand trembled when she touched the charcoal to paper. But with every line, something inside her loosened. The fear that she had lost her art, her voice, her worth, it began to fade, replaced by quiet wonder. One morning, while David was reading emails by the window, he noticed Naomi sitting cross-legged on the rug. Eli slept beside her. His tiny fingers curled around a plush toy. Lily, perched nearby, was watching Naomi's hand glide gracefully across the paper. "What are you drawing?" Lily asked, her chin resting in her palms. "You'll see," Naomi said with a mysterious smile. When she finally turned the sketch pad around, the drawing revealed David and Lily in the park, Lily laughing as David bent down to tie her shoe. The sunlight filtered through the trees, falling across their faces with warmth that felt almost alive. David's breath caught. It was a simple sketch, yet it felt too real, too intimate. She had captured not just their likeness, but something deeper, an affection he didn't know still showed on his face. "You drew this from memory?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. Some moments deserve to be remembered. He studied her, then longer than he meant to. She didn't flinch under his gaze, but there was something in her eyes, strength wrapped in gentleness, pain softened by grace. She looked at him as if she saw the man beneath the armor, not the billionaire everyone else bowed to. That evening, after Lily went to bed, David found himself standing in front of the sketch again. Naomi had left it on the console table, the faint scent of graphite still clinging to the air. His reflection in the glass beside it looked older, heavier, but in her drawing, he appeared lighter, almost at peace. He wondered if that was how she saw him, or how she wished he could see himself. The next day, he asked her to come along when he and Lily went to the park. She hesitated but agreed. The late afternoon sun painted everything in a mellow gold, and Lily ran ahead chasing pigeons with wild laughter. Naomi sat on a nearby bench, sketchbook balanced on her knees, watching them. David caught her gaze once across the distance. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment he felt time slow, the wind carrying the scent of rain, the sound of his daughter's joy, and the quiet pulse of something fragile but unmistakably alive between them. Later, when Naomi showed him her next sketch, it was of all three of them. Lily, between them, holding both their hands, faces turned toward a horizon, drawn in soft, blurred strokes. There was no city, no wealth, no loneliness, just light. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Words felt too small. Naomi glanced up, misreading his silence. "If it's too much." "It's perfect," he said, his voice rougher than before. "It's us." She blinked in surprise. For a heartbeat, she saw the man her art had revealed, the one who still carried love quietly beneath layers of loss. When she smiled, it wasn't shy this time. It was real, steady, warm. From that day on, she painted every afternoon. Sometimes David joined her, sitting beside her, with a book he never truly read, his attention caught instead by the way her fingers moved by the piece that seemed to return to her with each stroke of color. Neither of them said it aloud, but something invisible had begun to grow. Something both terrifying and tender. And in the quiet corners of his heart, David began to understand. It wasn't just her art that was returning to life. It was him, too. The invitation arrived in an envelope lined with gold foil, the kind that whispered wealth even before it was opened. The annual Walker Foundation Charity Gala, an evening of music, champagne, and cameras, where New York's elite gathered to write checks large enough to buy a conscience. David hadn't attended since his wife's death. He had always found excuses: business trips, exhaustion, grief. But this year, when the committee pressed him again, he surprised even himself. He said yes, and then, almost without thinking, asked Naomi to come with him. She stared at him, startled. "You want me to go with you only if you'd like to," he said, tone careful. "It's not about appearances. It's Just nice having someone real there. That night, Naomi stood before the mirror in the guest room smoothing the navy blue dress Mrs. Hill's niece had lent her. It was simple but elegant, the fabric draping softly over her frame. She hadn't worn anything this beautiful in years. The reflection staring back at her looked like a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed, confident, whole, radiant. David was waiting near the elevator in a black suit that fit him with quiet precision. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, admiration. Something unspoken. He didn't comment, just offered his arm. She took it hesitant, but smiling. The ballroom glittered like a universe built entirely of glass and gold. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen constellations, and the sound of violins shimmered in the air. Naomi tried to ignore the glances, the murmurs that followed them as they walked in. David's hand rested lightly on her back, a small anchor amid the waves of strangers. He introduced her simply as a friend. No titles, no explanations. For the first hour, things went smoothly. They chatted with board members, old colleagues, and donors. Naomi stood quietly beside him, her calm presence steadying him more than he expected. Every now and then, Lily's laughter drifted through his mind, the memory of sunlight in the park, and he found himself smiling again. But calm never lasts long in rooms built for judgment. Near the silent auction table, a tall woman approached. Her gown was emerald silk, her diamonds heavy enough to buy a small island. Her smile was sharp and practiced. "David Walker," she purred. "You've been hiding too long." Her gaze shifted to Naomi. "And this must be the young lady everyone's whispering about." Naomi offered a polite nod. "It's a pleasure." The woman's eyes swept over her dress, her posture, her skin, assessing, dissecting, discarding. "Quite the position you found for yourself," she said lightly. "It must be convenient keeping company with the city's most eligible widower." David's jaw tightened. "That's enough, Evelyn." But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Oh, I mean, no offense. Some people just have a gift for finding comfort without having to work too hard for it." Naomi's face didn't change. Her silence was its own kind of dignity. She met Evelyn's gaze evenly, then turned and walked away before another word could fall. David followed immediately, ignoring the murmurs left behind. By the time he reached the steps outside, the rain had begun soft at first, then steadier, washing the glitter off the city. Naomi stood on the curb, the ballroom's glow spilling behind her, like a memory already fading. The rain dampened her curls, her borrowed dress clinging to her frame. She didn't turn as he approached. "You didn't have to come after me," she said quietly. "I didn't have a choice," he replied. She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You heard what she said. People like her will always see me as a story that doesn't belong here." He stepped closer, taking off his jacket and placing it over her shoulders before she could protest. The fabric hung heavy, carrying his warmth. "Let them see whatever they want," he said, his voice low but steady. "You don't need to prove your worth to anyone. You already have." Naomi lifted her eyes to his, rain glistening like tears on her cheeks. "Why do you care so much?" David hesitated. The honest answer would have been too much too soon. So he said the truth in pieces. "Because I see you trying so hard to belong when you already do." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the city breathing around them, rain pooling at their feet. The noise from the gala softened behind closed doors, replaced by the rhythm of falling water. Naomi's hands tightened on the lapels of his jacket. Her head bowed slightly, and for the first time in years, she didn't fight the tears. They came quietly, not from sadness, but from being seen, from being respected. David didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, letting the rain soak them both. In that fragile silver moment, two hearts, one scarred by loss, the other by shame, found something neither had dared to hope for, again, a measure of peace. When Naomi finally lifted her face to the sky, her tears mixed with the rain. She closed her eyes and let it fall, every drop washing away the weight of who she had been told she was. And David, watching her, realized that beauty was not in perfection. It was in the courage to stand in the storm and still let yourself be loved. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind that carried the scent of coffee and wet sidewalks. Naomi had taken Eli for a walk through the upper streets of Manhattan. The weather was crisp, the leaves shifting into the deep oranges of early November. She had begun to feel lighter in recent weeks, more present, more whole. That morning David had left for meetings, his parting words gentle but distracted. Things between them had grown delicate. Familiar glances lingered too long. Unspoken words hovered in the space between their smiles. Naomi wasn't ready to name it, but she felt it something fragile, alive, like a seed trembling beneath thawing soil. She had just stopped by a florist's shop to admire the roses when the door opened and a woman stepped out, a tall figure in a beige coat, her hair perfectly pinned pearls at her throat. The scent of gardenias followed her, elegant and controlled. Naomi froze. Recognition struck like cold lightning. Mother. The woman stopped, her hand tightening around her purse strap. Slowly she turned. Her eyes, gray, sharp, unforgiving, met Naomi's with a flicker of shock that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed around them, indifferent. Naomi found her voice, first small but steady. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Her mother's gaze dropped briefly to the stroller. And yet you came back with that. Naomi followed her glance to Eli, sleeping peacefully, his small hand curled against his cheek. He's your grandson. Her mother's lips tightened. He's a reminder, she said, of shame, of poor choices. That's not a legacy I intend to carry. Naomi felt her knees weaken. You're still the same, she whispered, even now. The older woman's chin lifted. I raised you to have standards, Naomi, and look where you ended up, living off a man's charity again. Tell me, does he even know whose child you carry? The accusation stung, though it wasn't entirely new. Naomi straightened her voice, trembling. Eli is mine, and he's loved. That's all that matters. Her mother's expression softened for the briefest instant, then hardened again. Love, she said, almost to herself. That word has destroyed more lives in our family than it has ever saved. And with that, she turned away, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step a final punctuation mark in a sentence long overdue. Naomi stood there, her breath visible in the cold air. Something inside her cracked, not the sharp pain of anger, but the dull ache of understanding. For years she had believed her mother's cruelty came from pride. But now, watching her walk away, Naomi saw it clearly. It came from fear. The same fear that had driven her to hide everything real, everything messy. She gathered Eli into her arms and walked home through streets that blurred in her vision. When she entered the penthouse, David was there, standing by the window with a glass of wine in hand. The city's reflection shimmered behind him. He turned at the sound of the door and immediately saw her face, pale, tear-streaked, distant. What happened? He asked, setting the glass down. Naomi shook her head, her voice low. I saw her, my mother. He crossed the room in 2 strides, concern tightening his jaw. She said something, didn't she? She said, I was a shame. Naomi whispered, She said Eli wasn't her grandson. David's fists clenched, but before he could speak, Naomi continued, her eyes glistening. There's more. She mentioned your wife's name. Claire. He froze. What about her? Naomi took a breath. She said Claire was her sister. The silence that followed felt impossible, thick, stretching between them like glass about to shatter. David stared at her, his voice barely a whisper. Your mother was Claire's sister. Naomi nodded slowly. That means... She looked down at Eli asleep in her arms. Eli and Lily. They're related. He stepped back, the truth settling over him like a shadow. Claire's family, the one he had lost touch with after her death, was standing in his living room. The niece of the woman he had loved, holding a child who shared blood with his daughter. The world tilted for a moment, as if fate had played a cruel but precise trick. Naomi sank onto the couch, clutching Eli. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. I swear I didn't know who you were to her. David knelt in front of her, his expression unreadable. Shock. Sorrow. Perhaps something deeper. You couldn't have known, he said, finally, his voice rough but gentle. None of us could. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the windows, steady, cleansing, relentless. David looked at her, at the child sleeping in her arms, and something shifted in him once more. Fate had tangled their lives long before they'd met, binding them through pain, through blood, through loss. But sitting there in the quiet glow of that realization, it no longer felt like a curse. It felt like inevitability. And as Naomi wiped her tears, David reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, not as a savior, not as a man bound by guilt or pity, but as someone who finally understood that destiny wasn't something that arrived clean. It arrived wounded, imperfect and human, just like love itself. The storm came without warning. By morning, the air was thick with the scent of rain, the sky a low curtain of gray, pressing down over the city. Naomi had spent the early hours sketching while Eli napped peacefully beside her. She had been humming softly the rhythm of the pencil, keeping time with her breath. It felt like any other day, quiet, fragile, almost happy. Until she noticed the stillness. Eli wasn't moving. His tiny chest rose, but too slowly. When she touched his skin, the heat beneath her fingers made her blood run cold. Eli. Her voice trembled as she lifted him. His head lolled weakly against her shoulder, a small sound escaping his lips, faint and dry. The pencil fell from her hand. By the time she reached for her phone, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely press the screen. David answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, distant, the voice of a man in a meeting worth millions. Naomi. What is it? Her breath came in ragged bursts. It's Eli, he's burning up. He can't breathe right. I don't know what to do. There was no hesitation. Stay where you are. I'm coming. In a glass-walled conference room across Midtown, David rose from the head of the table. The room fell silent as he tossed his pen aside. Reschedule everything, he said simply. Now. No one dared ask why. Minutes later, his car cut through the rain-slicked streets. Naomi was waiting in the lobby, soaked and pale, Eli cradled tightly in her arms. David's coat was off before he reached her. He wrapped it around both of them, his arm guiding her toward the car with quiet urgency. The drive was a blur of headlights and wind. Naomi sat in the back seat, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years, rocking her son against her heart. David's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, to her face, the terror, the helplessness, and to the small body that meant everything to her. When they reached the hospital, he barely remembered parking. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh, the air heavy with antiseptic. A nurse whisked Eli from Naomi's arms and disappeared behind the curtain of an emergency bay. Naomi stood frozen, her hands empty, her voice gone. David took her shoulders gently. "He's in good hands," he said, though his own voice shook. She nodded but didn't seem to hear. When the doctor appeared moments later with rapid words, "High fever infection, IV fluids," Naomi barely caught them. All she saw was the tiny figure on the hospital bed, hooked to tubes, his small hand limp against the white sheet. She reached for him, but stopped, afraid of the machines, afraid of breaking the fragile line between life and something else. David moved beside her, placing his hand over hers. "It's all right," he whispered. "He can feel you." Her tears fell freely, then silent and steady. She felt his hand tighten, anchoring her to the present, when everything inside her wanted to collapse. Hours passed in fragments, doctors murmuring, nurses checking vitals, the steady hum of the monitors. Naomi sat by the bed, her head bowed, whispering Eli's name like a prayer. David never left. When exhaustion finally took her, she dozed in the chair beside Eli's bed. David covered her shoulders with a hospital blanket and remained at her side, his hand still clasping hers. For the first time in years, the fear returned, the kind that claws at a man's chest and reminds him how powerless even the powerful can be. He had buried a wife once. He could not bear to watch another life fade before his eyes. When Naomi stirred, her lashes heavy with tears, she found him watching her. The exhaustion in his face was raw, the kind that stripped away every pretense of strength. "I was supposed to be in a meeting," he said quietly, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "A deal worth more than most people make in a lifetime, and all I could think about was getting to you." Her lips trembled. "You didn't have to." He cut her off gently. "Yes, I did." His voice softened to something she had never heard before. Fragile, honest, unguarded. "Naomi, this is the first time in 3 years I've been afraid of losing someone again." She looked at him through the blur of tears. "And this is the first time I'm not running from it," she whispered. "Not this time." Something in his expression shifted, a quiet surrender. He reached for her hand again, and she let him. Their fingers intertwined, steady against the rhythm of the machines. When the doctor returned later to say the fever had broken, Naomi broke down completely. Relief poured out of her in soft sobs that shook her body. David stood behind her, his hand still on hers, his other resting gently on her shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that quiet, sterile room, beneath the hum of life returning to a fragile child, something deeper settled between them. No longer charity, no longer gratitude. It was love stripped bare of circumstance. And as the storm outside the hospital began to fade, David realized it wasn't the thunder he feared anymore. It was the thought of a world without her in it. A year later, the city bloomed in early spring. The streets of Manhattan shimmered with sunlight and the hum of new beginnings. The sign above the gallery door read, "Naomi Brooks Studio." Inside, light spilled through tall windows onto the polished floors, dancing across paintings that told a story only the heart could translate, portraits of motherhood, of resilience, of quiet moments caught between sorrow and grace. The room buzzed softly with the murmur of guests, patrons, and reporters. Near the entrance stood David Walker, composed but visibly moved, a pair of silver scissors gleaming in his hand. Beside him was Naomi, wearing a white dress, simple enough to be timeless. Eli clung to the hem of her skirt, and Lily stood proudly beside her, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning. David's voice carried gently over the crowd. When I first met Naomi, he began, I thought kindness was a small act, a gesture, a moment you offered, and moved past. But she taught me something far greater. He turned to her eyes, soft but sure. She taught me that love isn't about finding what we lost. It's about having the courage to love again, even after everything we thought was over. There was a quiet in the room, the kind that only comes when truth has brushed against every soul present. The ribbon fell with a clean, deliberate cut, and applause rose warm and genuine. Naomi smiled, tears glinting in her eyes, as the crowd moved to explore her world. Canvas after canvas painted from the fragments of her journey. Later that evening, when the guests had left, and the gallery lay bathed in the amber glow of sunset, Naomi slipped onto the rooftop terrace. The air was cool, touched by the scent of city rain and blooming magnolias. David joined her a moment later, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He passed one to her. Neither spoke for a while. Below them, the lights of New York flickered like a heartbeat. You did it, he said finally. Naomi looked out across the skyline. We did it, she corrected softly. You believed in me before I knew how to believe in myself. He smiled. I didn't give you faith, Naomi. I just reminded you where you'd left it. A soft giggle interrupted them. Lily had wandered onto the terrace, her hair tousled from the evening wind, Eli trailing behind her with a cookie in hand. She ran up to them and tugged at David's sleeve. Daddy, she asked, tilting her head, are we a family now? David looked at her, the little girl who had once asked him why a stranger was sleeping on a park bench, the same question that had rewritten all of their lives. He set his glass down and crouched to her level, pulling her Naomi and Eli close into one embrace. The setting sun painted them in gold. Forever, he said. His voice trembled, but his arms didn't. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, resting her head against his shoulder. In the stillness, she felt the weight of everything that had led them here. The pain, the loss, the choices, the grace of second chances. Somewhere below, the city kept moving, but up here, time felt suspended, as if the universe itself had paused to breathe with them. When they finally returned downstairs, the gallery was empty, save for one final guest, the moonlight stretching softly across the floorboards. On the far wall hung a single painting, framed in quiet reverence. A young woman asleep on a park bench, cradling a child beneath her arms. The same scene from that night long ago, but now the shadows were gentler, the colors warmer. The bench wasn't cold, it was bathed in light. Beneath the painting, engraved in small golden letters, were the words, "Kindness was where love began." Naomi stood before it, her reflection blending into the image. She reached out and traced the words with her fingertips, her lips trembling with the ghost of a smile. David came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "You've turned every wound into something beautiful," he murmured. She looked at him, eyes shining. "No," she whispered. "We did." Outside the city, exhaled the same city that had once been cold and endless, now seemed alive with promise. And as the last light of day melted into evening, the 4 of them, once strangers bound by loss, stood together beneath that painting, no longer broken pieces, but a whole imperfect family, stitched together by kindness and love. If you've ever lost something or someone and thought your heart could never open again, remember this: love doesn't vanish when life changes. It waits, quietly, patiently, in the kindest corners of us all.